Very nice voice. Yeah, when I was singing the solos, I said to Bert, Bert, Gene has a really deep, rich voice. That bass is just.
We used to sing some quartet type stuff, and Gino and I, it's convenient when you've got a first tenor and a low bass in the same
bass.
Yeah.
And we used to play trumpets together.
You played the trumpet too?
Yep, play brass. Yeah, trumpet, tuba, French horn.
So did I. I played trumpet, and I was in a band as well.
We need to do a trio.
I don't know if I can still play trumpet. It's been some years, Gene.
Yeah, the lip is the first thing to go.
Find some functioning instruments.
Yeah. But yeah, I used to. I love that. I played the tuba as well.
Wow.
The solos. I said
it takes a lot of breeze to blow a tuba.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I had good control, and I was an athlete back then. Yeah.
Well, it looks like we are up and running, ladies and gentlemen.
Cool.
Okay. Who's
All right.
on Facebook?
So let's take an in-depth look tonight, if you will, with me and with Gene and Patricia and whoever else comes in late and whoever else is watching live on live stream. And if you're watching the recording, you can skip as much as you want to, skip around in these studies. And if you're watching the sermons, you can just skip ahead to the minute mark where the message begins. I almost always include that. So why don't we take a look at how did we kind of looked at how we got to Gethsemane last week. Let's look at how we got to Golgotha. And I'm going to be sharing with you the same handout as last week. And you ought to be able to see it coming up shortly, I hope. Look what it's doing. It did that last week.
Yeah.
It's multiplying.
Like in a mirror in a changing room somewhere in a
it did the same thing last week, and I had to restart it.
Like it's cloning itself.
Okay, I think
there we go.
Yeah.
All right, so if you'll look up at the top, I wanted to go back and just hit Gethsemane real quick. You can see that we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John across the middle of the page there. That gives you the information about what's in each column. Over to the left is where it happened and essentially what happened. And we're going to start with Gethsemane, where Jesus is arrested. And I wanted you just to remember that Matthew and Mark call the place Gethsemane. They don't say the Garden of Gethsemane. They just say Gethsemane, and that means oil press in their native tongue. Luke identifies the place not as Gethsemane, but as on the Mount of Olives. Now, is that a contradiction? No, because Gethsemane is on the Mount of Olives. It's just at the foot of Mount of Olives. And then if you'll look in the upper right hand, Jesus identifies himself to the officers. He's not identified by Judas with a kiss in John. Jesus identifies himself. Who are you looking for? Jesus of Nazareth. If you're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, I am he, let these men go. Remember? So he calls it the Kidron, place is called the Kidron. So we know it's the Mount of Olives. We know it's the Kidron. We know it's Gethsemane. We know that there was a garden there because John says so. But he doesn't call it the Garden of Gethsemane. John doesn't even use the word Gethsemane.
But Christian folk over the years have just put it together.
Yes, it's to say Garden of Gethsemane is to combine these gospels, homogenize them, if you will, a little bit.
You know, Bert, we found out too that when we lived in Europe, they often talked about, we're going to have a picnic in the garden. And really all they meant was the backyard. I was expecting garden.
Hmm.
Guess it wasn't a proper noun. It was just where they hung out and had a barbecue.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's funny how people have different names for things. You know,
Yeah.
I remember when we had, Butch had a foreign exchange student from Germany, and he was all the time talking about he had gone to gymnasium. And at the time, I didn't know what that was. I thought it was gymnasium. But apparently that's what they call their public high school.
Yeah, high school, kindergarten,
Gymnasium. And
kindergarten, a place where
kindergarten,
kids go to play.
yeah,
Wow.
garden, and it has the word garden in it, kindergarten, child garden.
I think that's too why it's so important to understand culture and why certain things are called what it's called.
Yeah.
Like the garden, as we talk about here, and Gethsemane. It's fascinating to me.
It is fascinating.
But it has to do with
I think you'll
culture, and I
see-
think understanding the culture in Jerusalem or in Israel, in that part of the world, too, would help us probably understand the Bible a little bit better.
Well,
We understand the culture.
certainly when you note these little differences, it helps me. It helps me understand and put things together a little bit better. It's just a matter of becoming comfortable with and skilled at working with the material. And it's not that easy to do because most people don't practice it. But that's why we're doing it tonight. That's why we did it last week. That's why Gene did it this morning. Is when you look at the differences between the four gospels, you have insights into what those four gospel writers were up to and what the early church was emphasizing about Jesus and his life and death. Well, let's see what happens after they arrest him. So they arrest him in Gethsemane. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John agree in large part that Jesus was questioned and mistreated at the house of Caiaphas. Now, Mark, true, at this point just says the high priest's house, but he does say Caiaphas later.
Okay.
All right. And then Luke says the high priest's house. And then John says Annas and then Caiaphas. Now, who is Annas? Ever heard of him?
I've heard the name. Not the same as Ananias.
Annas is Caiaphas's father-in-law, and he was high priest before Caiaphas was. And so John may be having a memory here of, so it's the middle of the night, and by law, the Sanhedrin can't meet. So what do? They meet at Caiaphas's house and let Annas do the questioning. So it's not officially the Sanhedrin meeting, I guess. So they wait till morning, and then they do their official ruling when at the light of day, so that they technically aren't breaking any rules before they take him to Pilate and try to get him crucified. But they decide they're deciding not to stone him because they don't want responsibility for Jesus's death, being blamed by the people who love him. And why else? Why else would they send him to Pilate? Because Pilate's going to crucify him. And crucifixion is hanging on a tree. And hanging on a tree, according to Deuteronomy, is the curse of God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's the one that will do the ultimate.
Yep. So if you'll look at the top line there for Jerusalem, for Caiaphas's house, just take note that John gives us this added detail of we go to Annas and then Caiaphas. Now, we don't know if Annas and Caiaphas are two different houses that are nearby one another, or if it was one house or what, but it seems the scriptures seem to be consistent that it's Caiaphas's house, but John seems to think that the godfather of the high priest, Annas, is sort of in charge.
But what if he lived with him?
It's possible. It's possible that they lived together in the same palatial house up in the wealthier part of Jerusalem.
Doesn't that happen? Like almost like a royal family. People live, brothers and sisters, and whether you married, everyone lives in one house. And I thought
Well,
we
it
were
is if
talking
you're
with him
poor.
about,
If you're poor,
okay. Would you think he was rich?
who?
Caiaphas?
Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
Do I think he was rich? All those guys are rich. That's how they make their money. I mean, they're making their money off the temple. So yeah, they've got plenty of money. That's something they're not short on, and they by the way, they also bought their Caiaphas bought his office from what I read. He actually paid off Herod to become high priest. So he's not legitimate anyway.
Mm.
The whole thing's not legitimate. The trial's not legitimate. You can't have a trial at night, and they did. Annas is not the high priest, although probably he should be. And Caiaphas is not a legitimate high priest, and yet he has the title. But he was smart enough to send him to his father-in-law first.
Mm.
I think that was just strategy. All right, so let's go to the next one. Gino, you still with us?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
good. All right, the next one is Jerusalem at Caiaphas's house. Okay, in the courtyard of Caiaphas's house, Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times, and I want you to notice something. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John agree a lot, and that's rare. John is almost always going to be weird.
Mhm.
And here it's not weird. The exact same thing happens. Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times in the courtyard of the high priest. So there's lots of similarity there. Now there's some minor differences. John adds that it was a charcoal fire. That's a theological purpose that will raise itself later in John 21 when we have another charcoal fire on the beach.
Mhm.
But that's another story. All right, so there's a lot of parallel there where John is getting on board with Matthew, Mark, and Luke a little bit here.
Why do you think that is?
It's coincidental to the fact that John has this material, and it's not identical to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It may not even be dependent upon Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but the material is clearly the same, describing the same event.
Mm.
All right, let's try the next one. So we've got the denial having happened. Okay, now this is where Jesus is handed over by the Sanhedrin to Pilate. They take him to Pilate. All right, so they put it a little bit differently. Matthew says in the morning, which I think is a clue that they waited till the sun was coming up to take him to Pilate so that they could make it an official meeting of the Sanhedrin. But just, it was a really quick meeting. You know, it's like rubber stamp it, take him to Pilate. I think that's kind of, yeah, hit record. And they bind Jesus's hands and they accuse him before Pilate. Now, Mark also says it was in the morning. Luke doesn't mention what time it was. He just says the council, and he's the only one that refers to them as such, the Sanhedrin as the council. The council as a body, they walked together to escort Jesus to Pilate.
Mhm.
Think about that. Have you got that in your treasure trove of biblical images? The entire Sanhedrin marching Jesus through the streets of Jerusalem to Pilate. Hands bound. How about that? Bet you haven't had that one in your treasure chest. I hope you have it now. Okay, so how does John put it? John says that they take Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. Well, where's Pilate's headquarters? Well, it could be pretty near to Caiaphas's house in the wealthier part of Jerusalem, but it also could be the Antonia Fortress, which is where tradition says it happened. So depends on which place you start, which route Jesus took with the cross. All right. So let's look at the next one, and it's in Luke alone. Notice it's in red. This is Judas's suicide, and it's only recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. It's the only gospel that records it. Judas hangs himself in a potter's field called the Field of Blood, or Akeldama.
Mm-hmm.
I've been there. It's pretty spooky place. It's
Why do they call it the field of blood? Did other people hang themselves there too?
I don't know.
Hmm.
But they said, I think it was Matthew said it's called that to this day, which means to the day of Matthew's writing, which means decades after the events took place. So I don't know. Notice that I put Acts over there. That's because there's a reference to Judas killing himself in Acts of the Apostles. Now, Acts was written by the same writer who wrote the Gospel of Luke. We know it's the same writer. That's 100%. And in the book of Acts, Judas does kill himself, but he splits open by his belly when he falls on rocks. So this sounds more like self-stoning as opposed to hanging.
That's the only time I've ever heard of that. At least in scripture. Self-stoning.
Yeah.
It's the only example I know of in scripture.
Yeah, I think it is the only example. Unless there's something in the Old Testament that's not coming to mind right off the top of my head. Okay, so let's look at the next one. This is the trial before Pilate. And again, this looks pretty parallel. John is on board, generally speaking, with what's going on here. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all say that Pilate questions Jesus, that Pilate frees Barabbas instead of Jesus, that Pilate has Jesus flogged, that Pilate sentences Jesus, and that he sends Jesus away to be crucified. That's pretty much in all of the Gospels. However, you notice over in Luke, there is one red phrase, Pilate and Herod question Jesus. Only in Luke's Gospel does Pilate send Jesus to Herod for questioning. And then Herod mistreats him and sends him back to Pilate. And they become friends, according to the Gospel. They become friends from that day forward. All right. And then the last one at the bottom, who carries the cross? Well, this is one of the more interesting spots. Remember that it was not Jesus, it was not Judas who betrayed Jesus with a kiss in Gethsemane in John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, Jesus identifies himself, not anybody else. Likewise here, Jesus carries his own cross all the way to Golgotha, according to John. And according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it seems he didn't carry it at all.
Simon.
Simon was compelled immediately to carry it for him, and there's no mention of him falling. But see, the falls serve a purpose if you want to homogenize the Gospels, because it gives you the opportunity to say, well, Jesus tried to carry the cross, but he kept falling. So then they asked Simon of Cyrene to carry it for him. And Jesus actually did carry it himself. He just didn't carry it the whole way. You can see that's really bad exegesis. We need to let this tension stand, and we need to let John say what John's saying, and let Matthew, Mark, and Luke say what they're saying. And what they're saying is that Jesus did not carry his cross. It does not say why, and it doesn't say he fell. Now, it would have been heavy, and Jesus would have been beaten within an inch of his life. So the fact that he could have tried to carry it and fell is real, but it does not say that happened. Very well could have. We don't know.
But on the Via Dolorosa, there's a handprint where
he braced himself on the wall from one of those falls. That's correct, on the Via Dolorosa. You remembered well from your training on the video. And before long, one of these days, you're going to be standing right there. And I'm going to remind you of this moment.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So let's go down and let's see where we are next. All right. So after Jesus carries his cross to Golgotha, or Simon carries it for him, we have a little story that's only in Luke. The women are standing on the street and are following Jesus as he goes through the street, Simon carrying his cross, and the women are wailing and beating their breasts, and Jesus stops and says, "Don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children."
Yeah.
That's just in Luke. All right. The next verse is drink number 1, and it's only in Matthew and Mark. Luke leaves it out. John leaves it out. if they knew that it happened, which we're not certain of. But the first description would be in Matthew, and that's Jesus tastes wine mixed with gall, but refuses to drink it. Mark, the older of the Gospels, the oldest probably of the Gospels, writes, they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he refuses to drink it. And this particular beverage, pre-crucifixion, this is before they nail him to the cross, is only in Matthew and Mark. John has an interest in other material that he's going to add, and he rearranges the material and adds some things. And this is one of the things I guess he just left out, the first drink, the first beverage, because there are two. All right. Okay, so the next one is at Golgotha. It's, this is the cross. All right. So there is some agreement here with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The soldiers crucify Jesus. They don't describe how. It's really interesting. They crucify him, but we don't know. We just know that there were nails in his hands and feet, but we don't know precisely where or how this was done, right? In movies, they always lie him down and then hoist him way up in the sky on a tall cross, but that is not how the Romans crucified people. I'm just saying. Let's get with history and archaeology. And by the way, they found the second crucified remains, Roman crucified remains ever found, and it was found in England.
Really?
Yeah, it was found in 2017, and they just came out with a report in 2021. And guess where the nail was? The crucifixion nail went right through the heel, just like Yohanan's in Jerusalem. They nail through the side of the heel bone and sandwich your heel between the outside of the cross and the inside of the cross. And they use a piece of wood as a plaque, as a washer to sandwich your foot in there nice and tight. But if the head of the nail goes into a knot and gets stuck, they can just yank you free. And in the case of Yehohanan, the knot of wood came out and the crook of the nail was still in it. It was still in the heel bone. In the case of this guy who was crucified in England, the tip of the nail broke. The nail tip and the knot remained in the post. All you got is the heel bone with a broken nail through it. But we know that's how they crucified two people, the only two crucified remains ever found, and they both went through the heel bone on the outside of the cross. All right. What does that tell you? I mean, that's strong evidence that this is how they did it. The heel bone is the strongest bone in the human foot. It's also the biggest bone in the human foot. It can carry your weight, and that's why. It can carry your weight. All right, so gall or myrrh? Well, myrrh would be the older reading probably, and myrrh is the, remember gold, frankincense, and myrrh from the Magi?
Yeah.
Well, myrrh is what they use to embalm people or to, for burial, to anoint people for burial. So that would not have been an altogether strange thing to have had present there. The gall, I'm not sure about.
I've always heard gall.
But I think the idea is that
someone said it was bitter, right?
it's a drug that's supposed to dull your senses and help you manage the pain of crucifixion. Jesus tasted it, but refused to drink it. All right. Well, let's look at the next one. So this is Golgotha, the cross, over on the left, toward the bottom. Matthew says that the soldiers crucified Jesus. They gambled for his clothes and they sat down to guard him. This is the only gospel says that they sat down to guard him. That detail is very specific and it's very believable. That's what soldiers did. They waited for you to die. They just made sure no one came along to tear you free or that you didn't tear yourself free somehow. They sat there waiting for you to die, and it could take days in most locations, but not in Jerusalem, not on that day. That was the eve of the Sabbath, and it was the eve of the Passover. So they want the crosses empty. They want these corpses down by sundown. That's why they broke the legs of the criminals, as you're going to see, is to hasten their death, to get them off of the crosses before the holiday hits, or holy day, if you will. All right, so let's look at the cross. Matthew says they sat down and guarded him. Mark says that it was 9 a.m. when they began to gamble for his clothes. Luke says it was at the place of the skull. He doesn't mention Golgotha until this point. Luke scrambles up the material somewhat. So you'll notice that Luke is out of order in column 3 in places. And then John, there are 4 soldiers. I never noticed that before. They divided his clothes between the four of them.
Gamble for his tunic.
And then because the tunic was seamless, they decided to gamble for it rather than to tear it into 4 pieces. You got it? Okay, well, now let's look at the one at the bottom. This is what they call the titulus, or the sign that gives Jesus his crime. The written sign that they put on the cross to give what his crime was. And according to Matthew, it read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." According to Mark, the King of the Jews. According to Luke, this is the King of the Jews. According to John, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, if I had to guess which was the original, I would guess Mark, because it's the shortest and it's the one that leaves room for sarcasm. So you're the King of the Jews. Hail the King of the Jews. You know, there's that mocking tone. So he put the King of the Jews up there just to mock him, not believing that he really was. Right?
Yeah.
You follow?
This is part of my reading.
And so the chief priests asked Pilate to change the wording to, "This man said he was the King of the Jews," but Pilate refused by saying, "What I've written, I've written." Yeah. All right, so let's go down and let's get the next ones. All right. I went just a little too far. Here we go. All right, so the other 2 who are crucified with Jesus, Matthew says that the 2 men crucified with Jesus mock and taunt him along with others. Both crucified men mock and taunt Jesus along with others. Mark says 2 men crucified with Jesus mock and taunt him. So that's 2 of the Gospels saying that both criminals mocked Jesus. Luke has a whole new take with new information and new material. Luke says 2 criminals are crucified with Jesus, one on his left and the other on his right, and the leaders scoffed at Jesus, not the men on the cross. All right.
That's the story that I know and we've held on to.
Then underneath that in red, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And then underneath that in red, the 2 criminals speak to Jesus, and Jesus replies, "Today you will be with me in paradise."
Right. That's the story that we've
That's
heard.
that's a hugely expanded story that's only in Luke, and there it is. It has no parallel in the other Gospels. And what John says is the 2 others are crucified on either side of Jesus, and that's all that John says, agreeing, generally speaking, with the other Gospels, that there were 2 other criminals. By the way, the word that's used for those criminals is different in the Gospels, but none of them mean thief. They didn't crucify people for stealing. They did crucify people for being bandits, that is, violent criminals or robbers, brigands. They also crucified insurrectionists and runaway slaves. So I'm thinking they're revolutionaries or bandits, but we don't know for sure. All right, so let's go to what happens at 3 p.m. Golgotha, darkness. It becomes dark from noon to 3. This is recorded by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It becomes dark from noon to 3. Now, if you're looking for some sort of celestial explanation for that, and you're thinking maybe it's a total eclipse of the sun, A total eclipse of the sun only lasts about 2 to 4 minutes. So there's no way that this is an eclipse in any traditional sense of the word.
How do you know
Right.
that, Bert?
What?
How do you know that?
Who didn't know that?
No, how do you know that an eclipse only lasts that long?
Because
Experience?
I saw, yes, personal experience. Where was I? Let me think.
Hmm.
Where did I go to see that eclipse? I just can't recall.
Promised
I-
land.
Got an image in my mind. I think there's some horses around. I'm not sure. Okay, so all right, so the darkness. All right. John says nothing about that. The next one, Jesus quotes the first line of Psalm 22, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And they think that Jesus is calling on Elijah, Matthew says. The quote is a little bit different here because it's in Hebrew in Mark rather than in Aramaic. It's Eloi instead of Eli. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And they think that he's calling on Elijah to save him. And the thing that is sad and ironic about that is that these are the most sophisticated scripture experts, and they don't recognize Psalm 22. At least not at first. They're like, oh, he's calling Elijah. Well, hello, he just quoted a psalm you should know. You know? Okay, the next one. This is drink number 2 offered to Jesus. Now, Matthew says that a sponge on a stick is dipped in sour wine. Mark says a sponge on a stick is dipped in sour wine. Luke says the soldiers mocked him by offering him sour wine, no sponge or stick mentioned. Probably smart. And in John's gospel, Jesus says, I am thirsty. Sponge on a hyssop stick is dipped in sour wine. Why a hyssop stick? Well, again, that may be theology because the hyssop stick is what was used by the Israelites to paint the lamb's blood on the door so that the angel of death will pass over their house and their oldest will not die.
Yeah, when I see the
It's a
blood.
hyssop stick. So you see hyssop stick on a sponge here. Probably a theological rather than a historical reference, but who knows? All right, let's look at the next one. It's down at the bottom. This is Jesus's death. What happens the moment Jesus dies? Well, we have some variations here. Matthew says Jesus made a loud cry and breathes his last. Mark says Jesus makes a loud cry and breathes his last. Luke says Jesus cries in a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commend my breath, spirit, and he breathes his last. And John, after receiving the wine, he says, by the way, that's the only reference to him taking that sour wine from that sponge on the stick. Can't believe he took it. After receiving the wine, he says, it is finished. And he bows his head and gives up his spirit/breath. The same word is used for breath and spirit. It's pneumata in Greek or ruach in Hebrew. All right, that's his death. All right, now, what women were there? Well, Matthew says many women. Mark just says women who followed him in Galilee. These were Galilean women, and they witnessed the crucifixion. Luke says that women who followed Jesus witnessed his crucifixion from a distance, going home beating their breasts. And John says 4 women and 1 of the 12 were near the cross. Now that's an interesting tension. You've got 4 women near the cross with John, or the beloved disciple, according to John's gospel, but in Luke, the women are nameless and they watch from a distance.
So what's standing out to me now too is John is the other one who also said it was 4 soldiers, right? Who
Said it was 4 soldiers and 4 women.
gambled for his,
All right. So Now, John adds some details. If you'll look, Jesus makes arrangements for his mother. Jesus's mother is not named in John's gospel. It's just called, she's just called Jesus's mother, or the mother of our Lord, or something like that. She nor John are named. So here are the two unnamed people, Mary and John, Jesus's mother and the beloved disciple, at the foot of the cross. And Jesus is making provision for his mother by handing her into John's care as he's dying on the cross. And he says, woman, behold your son, and behold your mother. So he takes, which is interesting because, I mean, Mary had other sons, right? I mean, what's James? Chopped liver? I mean, he's the next son in line, right? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, Golgotha to tomb. There's agreement here, especially around Joseph of Arimathea. And this is the first we learn about him. Joseph of Arimathea, according to Matthew, retrieves Jesus's body and lays it in a new family tomb while women disciples watch him do so. Mark says Joseph of Arimathea retrieves Jesus's body and lays it in a new family tomb while the women disciples watch. Luke adds a little bit. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council who did not agree with what they did to Jesus, retrieves Jesus's body and lays it in a new family tomb while the women disciples watch. And we get another detail from John. Joseph of Arimathea retrieved Jesus's body, and with Nicodemus's help, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, both on the council, both help bury him. Nicodemus brings spices, and they laid him in the new family tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, in which no one had been buried. And we are almost done. This is the last one. At the bottom, concerning the tomb, only Matthew tells us that at the request of the Pharisees, the Pilates placed guards outside the tomb. All right, that's it. So let me stop the share and we'll go back to Gino and whoever else. I want to pull up that, and I want to pull up this. There we go. There we go.
No, I know Becky and Kathy are both on Facebook.
Yeah, I see Kathy. Kathy Chitwood. I sure do see her.
Hey, Kathy. Hey, Becky.
Yeah, what happened to the guards? She asked. Well, according to Matthew, an angel moved the stone with an earthquake and sat upon it. Meanwhile, the guards fell to the ground like dead men, if I recall correctly.
Dead men tell no tale.
And then they went and reported what happened, and they made up a story to cover it up, that they saw the disciples steal the body. Thank you for that good question, Kathy. I appreciate that. And Becky says, hey, Patricia.
Hey.
And so what struck you guys as new?
Well, one thing that struck me was how John is so descriptive about how many. He was very intentional, seemed like. I mean, he did that twice. So that kind of struck me, that he was the only one who named the amount of persons.
The number of soldiers and the number of women.
Number of soldiers who gambled for his clothes, and then the number of women at the tomb. I mean, so that, yeah.
I'm gonna tome you.
The tomb.
I'm gonna tome you on your head. I'm gonna step on your toe.
It's culture.
It's culture.
Get used to it.
It's culture.
Culture. The tomb. The tomb.
What about you, Gino?
I was laughing at home. I had, the whole idea of the folks just missing the significance of the 22nd Psalm always knocks me out every time I think of it. And I always remind folks, let's see, what follows Psalm 22? That'd be the 23rd.
Mhm.
It was not an accident what he quoted.
No. Since it described exactly what they were doing to him.
And Matthew is so intentional about that, connecting it with his Jewish Christian audience. The others, I think we believe the others are dealing more predominantly Gentile, who need a little more backstory sometimes. And then whatever planet John dropped in from,
Yeah.
has always got those extra layers of meaning that are so rich.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, so Luke surprised me too, in that with extras, because it seemed like last week we covered more John with the extra details. Today, it seemed like Luke had more extra details when it came to two others who were crucified, about the two men.
Yeah, like I said, and if you look, they're out of order. They're, I had to move them to get them to match Matthew and Mark. I had to move Luke's verses around a little bit because, he's writing about what they wrote about, but just not in the place he wrote, not in the same spot. So I had to move a few things, but yeah, I think Luke, as much, if not more, adds to the information we have about the crucifixion and the events surrounding it. And it's certainly rearranged. Similarly to John. John often rearranges things as well. So
they were not thieves, then who were they? Are there crimes mentioned anywhere else?
They're violent robbers. The word that's used for robbery, or it's best translated probably insurrectionist.
What?
Someone who attacks the emperor. Someone who's violently causing an uprising or a riot or something. Yeah. We have a comment from Kathy. There are references to angels in that's in the empty tomb story. How do you think they knew they were angels? I'm not sure how to identify an angel. Well, I think that's a really, really helpful question because I think it's in Mark's version, it just says, didn't it say two young men? Or was it in Matthew that it was two young men? Which one was it?
I think it's Mark.
Where does it say two young men?
On the cross here?
Find the people who were crucified with him.
Oh, we were just there. Two crucified on either side. Two men crucified with Jesus mocked and taunt him with others. Says Matthew and Mark. And then Luke went into more detail, but the two criminals speak to Jesus, replying, today you will be with me in paradise. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then the angels. Where's that? Was the angel on this chart?
I don't think we talked about angel. I don't remember angel here. Is she talking about the angel, what, at the tomb?
Yeah, at the tomb.
He's not gonna let it go, Gene.
No.
Yeah, I don't see the angels here, but I'm sure it was one individual in one gospel. It was two individuals in another gospel, and they're described as men, not angels, in one gospel, and they're described as angels in other gospels.
Becky says angels are the ones who tell you not to be afraid.
Of course, this means messenger.
Yes.
It means messenger. That's
so
correct.
Are they divine heavenly angels? Are they just messenger? Are they
Well, I mean, all I can say is that from my studies, I happen to know that there aren't any female angels, and there are only two named male ones, and that's Michael
And Gabriel?
and Gabriel.
Gabriel.
Yeah, and that they in no way are ever described as anything other than looking exactly like a human being. No wings, just a human being.
And then let's see, the L in the name refers to God, and I'd have to look up the other parts. Mike L, Gabriel, right?
Hmm.
I don't know what that means, but it just,
I think Michael's like strong man of God or something like that, and
Gabriel's a trumpet player.
But right in Matthew 28, I guess it would come after this. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid.
Do not be afraid.
You're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here. He's risen," as he said, "Come see the place for the Lord."
yeah, and the message that the angel or angels give is different too. But we were not focusing so much on the resurrection and as we were the crucifixion at this point in time. So that's right at the edge. This is the next thing that happens is the angel situation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Becky had another question too. What was the significance of the tunic being without seams?
I don't know what the significance of the tunic is, that being out without seams, except that they seemed to value that garment more than the others because of that fact. It wasn't patched together. It wasn't four pieces connected. It was one complete piece. So I guess that means that it's of more value.
Yeah.
At least it was to the soldiers. I can't imagine buying someone's clothes right off their back like that. Not buying, but gambling their clothes right off their back like that.
If it's valuable, people, if they were in Louis and all these designers, people would go for that. I mean, when they break into these stores, they take all the high-priced purses and leather and designer stuff that cost thousands of dollars. They don't want the cheap purses and stuff. They go for the main stuff.
And it has to do.
They sold it all on eBay.
Yeah.
How does it have to do?
No, just saying it comes from the tunic. We're assuming that the tunic was of high value.
It would have been more valuable.
Yeah.
In one piece than two.
Something about that.
Yeah.
I would
think it would be perceived to be more expensive, a nicer piece, a nicer garment. So,
like you said, it's in Psalm 22.
Yeah.
The raiment, cast lots.
They cast lots, yes. And pierced his hands and feet, and I'm surrounded by evildoers. They wag their head at me.
They make mouths at me.
They make mouths at me.
Yeah.
I don't remember where I saw it, Bert. I remember seeing a stained glass window once, and Jesus is in Gethsemane, and there's a shadow of an angel giving him comfort, but behind it, you can see the outline and just barest illumination of what looked like hundreds of angels just waiting for the call.
Mm-hmm.
It was a real interesting symbolism. It's probably one of those traditional things.
I guess that references the Matthew verse about, do you not realize that I could call upon my Heavenly Father and he would send 10,000 angels to protect me?
There's a song about that. He could have called 10,000 angels to save the world and set them free. So that came from.
I think it's Matthew. We'd have to check.
And Luke has the angel comforting him.
In Gethsemane?
Yeah.
Cool.
But it's just, I had not thought about that in a long, long time but I thought it was very subtly done, the window. But of course, they don't show up and win the day, and we know how it turns out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's in Matthew too. That's Matthew 26. Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us and he would send them instantly? That's the English Standard
Matthew
Version.
26.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, when I'm reading all of these things, I guess probably more than for y'all, I have lots of memories of these locations seared into my brain. And I'm looking forward to the day when you all can share what I'm seeing.
Yeah. I think it'll make more sense to me.
I
Seeing
think
it,
Gethsemane and the temple and the whole shebang will
Mhm.
make more sense when you see it.
Yeah, it'll just, the image, can't get the image out of you for me. I don't think I'll be able to get the image of it's like the Via Dolorosa. I'm thinking about that every time I hear that now. I'm already thinking about that path, that winding
Mhm.
road that leads to
Squirms through the market.
yeah. So it's there. It can't be moved, cannot be removed. So I'm thinking also about, I really like, I mentioned it earlier about Luke picking up the details on this latter part of the chart tonight.
Mhm.
And I understand too how preachers, because all of my life, I've heard the extra details. When John, last week when we talked about it, I've heard those details from John. Where was it? When he raised Lazarus from the dead, Mary, Lazarus' sister, anoints him, Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, goes out, foot washing, all of those things that John mentions, I've heard growing up and even in my early adult years. And now tonight, as we look at Luke, but it's always seemed like the church, Christendom, has really held on to the details, like the extra details, even though one of the office may have mentioned it, it's gospel. It's like, yeah, because this one mentions it, and it is to make the story. I don't know if it just makes the story sound better by putting in all the extra pieces. But yeah, that's amazing. That's just stands out for me as well. Yeah, even the three might be saying one thing, but the one who says something different, we hold on to that, and that becomes part of the story too, which it is. I'm just noting it. I'm just seeing it in a different way tonight. I guess looking at the table itself.
Yeah, and that was my hope, because learning to work with this material in parallel is getting to know Jesus. I mean, this is where you meet the earliest people who are telling you about him, these gospel writers.
Yeah.
We don't.
It's very much, in some ways, Bert, it's very much akin to a great book. And a director in the 30s made a movie about it. And then somebody came along in the 50s and said, I can do better than that. I'll make a movie of it. And then Quentin Tarantino comes along in the 90s and says, well, I can do better than that. The next thing you know, J.J. Abrams is making one. Well, which is the real movie on the book? Well, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Then sometimes they change the ending or merge characters, or they take their own liberties and artistic license for their reasons. Sometimes we never know what those are.
Yeah.
But one of the things I really struggle with sometimes is in study during the week before preaching on Sunday, being very intentional not to blur the lines and not mix Luke's story with Matthew's if I'm preaching on Matthew. I try to tell it Matthew's way.
Or Mark, whichever gospel you're preaching.
Whatever's the election that week that I'm picking, that picked me, I try to live in that reality that Sunday.
Gene, are you saying that you usually preach from just one or a collection of all the other gospels together if you're preaching on one particular topic?
Just one. Occasionally I find commonality between all the readings on a particular Sunday in the lectionary, which is really cool when you can weave that as one. But
Mhm.
if my gospel text, and that's what I'm preaching on, is Mark, I live with Mark that week, and I try not to mingle John in to confuse it, blur it, because most folks, preachers and parishioners, blur that already.
Yeah, they use both.
What's Bert's word? Your homogenized gospel.
Yeah.
It's often watered down.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the impulse to fix. You know,
Yeah, to fix the void, the fill in the blanks.
fix what appears to be a contradiction.
Yeah.
You have one gospel saying one thing, you have another gospel saying another. How do you manage that? Well, one way to manage it is preach one of them.
But what if it makes sense then, though, to include John?
Then
Because
that's an exegetical call. That's cool. I mean, for me, it's just I just have to be able to justify that to myself.
Mhm.
Okay.
And sometimes you just point out the difference,
Point out the
Yeah.
difference.
not as a contradiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hear you.
I love
Kat?
the chart. I love the chart, Bert.
Mhm.
Oh, thank you,
Yeah, that's
Gina.
helpful.
How can we get a copy of the table you put together? It is very informative. Well, it's a Word document, so all I need is for you just give me an email address and I will just email you the Word document.
Mhm.
Be glad to do that.
Yeah, it's very helpful to see it all together.
And I have one online for the resurrection as well that I did years ago that you can look at. Same thing.
Mhm.
It's just a chart of how they manage the details differently, these four gospels, when it comes to the resurrection.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's interesting how we put our own interpretation, like the Eli, that he was calling on Elijah, or Eloi, Lama Sabachthani. Yeah, just interesting. I think it's important for us as preachers, or to fill in the blank, so to speak. Like we have to know what it means. Like we have to come up with something.
Fix the contradictions and fill in the blanks.
Yeah, and I think that's where we get in trouble. I mean, but because
I'd have to go back and count, Patricia, but I'm willing to bet you can count on one hand the number of times the gospel writers preserved Jesus's words either in Hebrew or Aramaic. And that says to me, this is something very important. Why did they do that?
Yeah,
Why did they preserve his exact words?
yeah.
Knowing that we wouldn't know what they meant.
No, I need subtitles.
Yeah. I tell you, part of it, I believe, is you have to appear smarter, that you know what you're talking about. And I must give my congregants the information, the meaning of this. Come with me, and and it's all about style, and it's it's a lot of things that I have experienced, and you want to let people know that you know what you're talking about. So wherever you can fill in the blank to make it fit, you do that. I think that's what's happening a lot of times too with preachers. Yeah.
It is tragic when the preacher doesn't know how to pronounce it, though.
Teaching the others how to do it.
Yeah. But then again, who's going to know?
Yeah.
Labyrinth.
Lazarus.
Latherithmus.
Lazarus.
Mary Elizabeth.
Jonah was swallowed by a Leviathan.
Leviathan, yeah. I don't know who.
That's a Harry Potter word, right?
Yeah, Leviathan.
That's Kathy's email. Is that CCC 2257?
CCC 22579. Is that right, Kathy?
Okay.
CCC 22579. We got it.
Okay.
Cool.
Appreciate all of you all for being here tonight. Appreciate it very much. Good questions from Catherine tonight for sure.
And
Thank you,
Becky,
Patricia, and who else was here?
Becky and.
Becky and Gino.
We are in the post-resurrection sabbatical week thing, in some ways.
I guess so. I know Mike is at a choir rehearsal and Dale is probably asleep somewhere near
In
Cairo.
Egypt,
Yeah,
being in the tomb,
he's in the tomb.
underneath the pyramids.
The pyramids.
Oh, Lord. And my sister Debbie, she's taking ordination classes every Wednesday. So that's why she hasn't been here in a while.
And Kia was with us this morning.
Okay. Yeah, Kia, I think she prefers the morning to evenings, which is cool. I mean, she's getting it either way.
Maybe it fits her schedule now better or something.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah.
people can do what they want to do, and that's why we're here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jane. I appreciate you.
Appreciate y'all too.
Thank y'all. Take care.
Hope you have a good evening.
Good evening.
What is
Take care.
that? Look closely. Wow. Oh, wow. That's people. Yeah. Goodness gracious.
Mm.
What is it? Where?